Cannon. Let's bring in the panel. MSNBC's Joe Scarborough, Newsweek's Howard Fineman, the Washington Post, Eugene Robinson, and the Nation magazine's great, illustrious Katrina Vanden Heuvel.
You don't want to hear sexist charges.
Okay, no, it's not. It's the Katrina part I love. It's so close to a hurricane. Joe.
You know, Chris, for the record, I asked Buchanan this morning if he ever cried in a campaign, and he said he did. A 17-year-old girl was tearing up, and he hugged her and broke down. I then asked John Edwards whether he had ever cried in a campaign, and he, of course, was critical of Hillary Clinton for crying. And he sat there, seriously, stared at me for a couple of minutes and said, no, I never have. Tough guy, I guess. I'll tell you what. That's a tough dude, I guess. I don't know a politician who hasn't teared up at some point. So anyway, let's forget about crying, the crying game, and let's talk instead about what we're going to be looking at tonight, what the takeaway is going to be from New Hampshire. These poll numbers are starting to come in. I'm just blown away. 43% of the people that voted in the Democratic primary, independents. 38% of the people that voted in the Republican primary, independents. What if John McCain wins by a couple of points over Mitt Romney, and yet Romney's the guy that carries the most Republican votes? What impact does that have moving forward? Do we have John McCain once again winning New Hampshire, but then getting beaten up in South Carolina and other Republican states?
Well, I think that's a good question, Joe. I'm not sure where he goes after this. If you look at the other states down the line, McCain's not leading in Nevada. He's not leading in South Carolina. He's not leading in Florida. He's not leading in California. He's really not at the top of the charts in any of those other states.
And as Chris said, when you get to South Carolina, when you get to Florida, when you get to these close primaries, they ain't independents like New Hampshire. No, DeLay was right. It is new territory.
Well, that's true on both sides. I mean, if Hillary has any hope after tonight, it's probably going to be that in those closed big state primaries, and there are a few on February 5th, she might be able to salvage herself. In the case of Mitt Romney and others, they need to find a way to go after McCain in those type of states, and South Carolina will be one of them.
And Katrina, let's talk about the Democrats for a second. This race right now, we're only about 7, 8, 9% in. A little bit closer than we expected. Let's say it's 3, 4 percentage points. Obama beats Hillary Clinton with a huge Democratic turnout. You've got 43%, according to our exit polls, of independents voting. That would mean most likely Hillary Clinton would carry the Democratic voters within her own primary. Is that a victory for her?
Let me just say quickly, I wanted to go back to something Dee Dee Meyer said, not about Hillary Clinton as a front runner, but how this race should not be over quickly, though it may be. It's a disservice to voters. It's a disservice to our democracy. We come out of the longest election preseason in our history, and suddenly it might be over. You know what kind of change we need? We need to bust open the system, this money-drenched political system in this primary. I think Obama has the capacity, with the momentum, the wind at his back, to redefine an alignment where you have independence and you're also reaching out to the base. I think in Nevada he can do that, and I think in South Carolina for sure, where, as we talked earlier, you have half of the Democratic Party African Americans who see him now as a viable candidate, plausible, coming out of New Hampshire and Iowa.
But Gene, on the Republican side, though, again, let's talk about, let's say McCain wins tonight by a couple of points, 4 or 5 points, but it's independents that gave him the victory. Your home state of South Carolina is going to break his heart again, isn't it?
Oh, I think it probably will. I think my home state is going to go for Huckabee. I really do.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he's resonating.
But again, the question is, how important is New Hampshire if you have these independents that are driving a process that gets much more closed after it's over?
Two things about that. Number one, a lot of the independents in New Hampshire aren't all that independent. I mean, they're independent because you get to be independent in New Hampshire, you get to vote early, you get to influence the process, and they like to go back and forth between the Democratic and Republican primaries. And in other states, in those closed states, they pick one party or the other. The other thing, at least on the Democratic side, New Hampshire is really not that representative of the Democratic coalition. There's so few African Americans, for example. Right. So you can't generalize about South Carolina or Florida or a lot of other states.
You say that about New Hampshire, but how do we hear that about Republicans in New Hampshire also, that it's not that representative of a state, and yet it's supposed to elect presidents?
Well, here's the thing. Both Iowa and New Hampshire are very close states in the fall. They're both razor-thin margin between Republicans and Democrats, so they're worth looking at from that point of view. But I think the results likely out of New Hampshire tonight are going to mean that this thing is still wide open on the Republican side. Wide, wide, wide open. It's going to be a long process among the Republicans, I think.
Very long
I think
process.
it's going to be internal, a brutal process, because they're looking...
Don't sound so happy. Yeah.
But think about it. 2 years ago, Tom DeLay, dominant political force, now fractionalized, factionalized.
Yeah, we shall see. All right, back to you. Keith, what you got?
Joe Scarborough, the polls in New Hampshire will be closing across the state in just a few minutes. We think we know what to expect.